Welcome everybody to the first book talks of the library. We are having a series of book talks as we normally do, and this is the first one. The presenter is Professor Shalom Holtz, H-O-L-T-Z, and the book is Praying Legally. Without further ado.
So I think the plan that we worked out is that I'll start with a brief, as it was called, spiel about the book, summarizing or otherwise, telling you what's there, and then Shalamis will ask a few questions from her reading of the book, and from there I'm happy to take other questions. Okay. The title of the book and kind of the controlling idea of the book, the thesis, if you will, is that prayer throughout the ancient Near East, which I define as going back as far as, say, 2000 BC, and as far back as 2000 and as far forward as the machzorim currently in use in synagogues, but we're talking about at least 1,000 years earlier than that, than today. The fundamental to that, to prayer throughout the ancient Near East, is a connection to human courtrooms. The notion that the basic metaphor, or I won't say the basic, but a basic metaphor of prayer, that is, of the encounter between the divine and the human through prayer, is the courtroom. And to make that claim, or to justify, to support that claim, I relied on documents attesting to legal procedure, courtrooms. Like, what did courtrooms sound like? What did courtrooms? How did courtrooms operate? If I'm claiming that there is a metaphor at the center of this, which is the courtroom, so how did they? To find out how they worked, I went to ancient Near Eastern courtrooms, and I compare the language of court proceedings in human courtrooms with the language of and formulation of prayers, and thus petitioning God or gods in the divine courtroom. That's the main thesis of the book. The thesis is presented in an introduction plus 4 chapters. The introduction takes you through the history of the scholarship on this idea. It's not totally original to me. The idea was observed in a number of different studies of, particularly on the Hebrew Bible, but as well on rabbinic literature, and to some degree on ancient Near Eastern literature as well. And then I situate the book in the context of the study of metaphors in general, and how do we get about metaphors, and why it's important to anchor metaphors in some kind of reality. This is very distracting. It'll come up later why why that's there. If I close it, will it?
Yeah, sure.
It's not going to go off. No. Okay. Can we mute it or something like that? Okay, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
There's nothing going on.
Okay, nothing to see there. Okay, after the introduction, chapter 1 is a chapter called "The Idea of Praying Legally," in which I interrogate words for prayer, different terminology for prayer, and uncover, and also some writings about prayer, including some midrashim and rabbinic works, in which which support the idea that embedded in the language about prayer, the terminology of prayer, there is this conception of prayer as a courtroom. Prayer as a courtroom encounter between the speakers and the gods. Chapter 2 is called Praying as a Plaintiff, and that expands an article that I wrote about 8 years ago on specifically demands for judgment, judge my case in various groups of prayers, as well as the self-presentation of the speakers in prayers as petitioners before the gods. Chapter 3 is, I think, my own personal favorite chapter, I think, is called Prayer, Procedure, and Protest, in which I press further with this idea and examine three specific types of speech in prayer: confession, and oaths, and questioning God. And I claim that in all those cases they make use of courtroom procedures and demonstrate that those were actually things that you might do. And even kind of the farthest reaching conclusion in my book, I think, is that speakers allow themselves to question God and in a manner that would suggest the kind of turning of tables in a lawsuit. That is, they feel themselves being prosecuted, and they kind of switch sides, and they argue that they're kind of trying to sue God in a court of law. Finally, I conclude with a chapter called the audience in prayer. The audience in prayer's courtroom, I believe is what I called it, in which I talk about some new studies of prayer in the ancient Near East that talk about the audience concept. That is, the encounter between divine and human subjects is modeled in some way on the formalities of the encounters between humans and higher authorities in general. And I argue the point that, yes, that's true, and the courtroom is one specific kind of such encounter. And I study various terminology surrounding that, including God's responses to prayer, including the petitioner's self-positioning, in other words, where they stand, to stand before, things like that. And I discuss the audience concept. The conclusion asks the question, why do we do this? Why would courtroom imagery inform prayer? And I follow the lead of some recent studies of metaphor, which talk about how metaphor has a certain empowering capacity, right? It allows humans to talk about things that they otherwise can't talk about or are not able to talk about. And I suggest that the idea of law, of the courtroom, gave humans, and this is sort of a little bit of a pun, but I think it's important, a sense of standing, in the sense, legal standing before the authorities. And I demonstrate through some texts that would be a critical point for them. Okay, that's the book. Some questions I get just from talking to people. It took me about 10 years to write. The daughter who was a year old when I wrote the article is now almost bat mitzvah, so we're talking about 10 years. And then, but the work began, I suppose, in about 20 years ago when I began my doctoral work. But the investment begins in college when I started learning Akkadian and took advanced classes like that. So exactly how long you want to stretch, we can stretch this back 25 years if we really want. Other than that, I'm open. I guess Shlomis and I will have a conversation, and then we'll move from there.
Okay, so I read your bio, I did my homework, and I see you're an Assyriologist. So I said to myself, I have no idea what that is. So being a librarian, I figured, let me look it up. And then I discovered that Professor Holtz has actually given a talk to 6th graders at BPY, which is Ben Porat Yosef Yeshiva, New Jersey. And the write-up on that talk says that Assyriology is the archaeological, historical, and linguistic study of ancient Mesopotamia and related cultures that use cuneiform, how do you say it?
Cuneiform.
Cuneiform writing. So I was just wondering, what role did cuneiform
So this is where the pictures come in. Shalomis asked me if I could bring some pictures, and when you do it for 6th grade, you gotta have pictures, but even when you do it for others, so here we go, right? Can I make it bigger?
Yep,
How's
good.
that? Is it bigger?
Yes. Oh, you could press the plus sign on
Plus sign. Where is it?
Middle top.
above the photo to the left, right above.
There. Thank
Yeah,
you.
there you go.
Just click on move the slider.
Thank you.
Does it go anymore? Oh, good.
This is good. Okay, so there are two ways that cuneiform texts inform the discussion here. So to just catch you up from 6th grade, cuneiform is the writing system. Think of it as the font for any number of languages that were in use in the ancient Near East from about 3000 BC to about 300 BC, a little bit later. Around the turn of the Common Era is when we really stopped seeing it. It was originally invented for Sumerian, but the main language that was used, which became the lingua franca at one point in the region, is a language known as Akkadian. Okay? Now, I use the materials in Akkadian in two ways. This is one text, an example of a text, known as Maklu, which is a series of tablets looking like, this is the third in the series of, it's like 9 tablets long. It is a ritual. Actually, Yeshiva College alumnus discovered that it was a ritual. The Yeshiva College class of 1960-ish, his name is Tzvi Abush, now a professor at Brandeis University for the time being, discovered that it is a day and a half long ritual, or a night and a half long ritual, like overnight and then the next morning. So he was one of the first to interpret the ritual as, in part, a trial of the witch that you're trying to, who you believe you've been hexed. Okay? One believes one has been hexed by a witch, so you put the witch on trial, you declare her guilty, and you burn her. The name Maklu is related to the Hebrew word kalui, which means toasted. Maklu is burning, and there's a lot of burning involved in the ritual. In the end, you burn her in effigy, you scatter her ashes to the winds, and you come out, you emerge, the patient, we call him, emerges purified. Along the way, you put the witch on trial near the very beginning. And that was, so one way in which cuneiform texts inform the discussion is that you find that there is a similar approach to prayer, to ritual, to prayer, where you invoke the courtroom. And it's not just here, it's a number of other prayers and incantations that presume a courtroom setting, as it were, the divine courtroom. So just as one finds that in biblical and rabbinic texts, one finds that in earlier texts like this one. This is a photo I took off of Wikipedia. The other example, let's see if this will, oh, this is now escape. Let's see if oh no, it's not going to do that, so I'll open up the file again. The other example, and I already mentioned this a little bit, is this is another example. The first thing you'll notice, I don't know if I can put them up side by side. I think I can. Okay, now you see the two of them next to each other. Leaving aside the coloring, this is a black and white photo. This is a later photo. What you'll notice that you'll see that there are 2 columns here and multiple lines dividing it. The one on the Maklu image is a better written tablet. It's fancier, it's longer, it is actually bigger, easier to read than this one on the left, on the right. This is an example of a court record. From the time of the king Nabonidus, who was the last Babylonian king. Some of you who went to the talk yesterday may have heard of him. And you'll notice here, this is pretty well written, nicely written, but it is smaller. It's only got 1 column of text, and it flips over to the other side, so it's just 1 column. And the back side is sealed. This was a private record, effectively. This was a record that was kept by the person who would have won the lawsuit. This is actually an interesting case where there was basically an attempt to defraud someone. And they chew the tablet. It's funny. It's actually a funny tablet to read. It's probably the funniest one you'll find. And it's not that funny. So, but how this figures in here in the book is that texts like this one record plaintiff statements that conclude with, judge my case against so-and-so. The line appears here as well. And so that was one of my entry points into what did courtrooms look like on Earth And are there similarities to those, to the courtroom imagery, or can they help us understand courtroom imagery in the divine courtroom, in prayers? So you have the kind of literary text on this side, and so there's a literary tradition on the one hand, and there is this legal tradition on the other hand, both of which are informing the arguments in the book. That was thus my Assyriological background working here.
Now, you said that this started maybe 25 years ago, this whole research. What made you choose the topic of law and prayer?
Okay, so it began, that part is not 25 years old.
Okay, well, whenever it happened.
So my original concept for my dissertation work, and I see there are some graduate students here, so one of the things one learns when one proposes a dissertation topic is that one is often going to bite off more than one can chew, or one need chew in a dissertation. So the original concept for the dissertation was to write a book like this, or a study like this, about courtroom imagery in prophecy, specifically in the book of Isaiah. What ended up happening is that I got stuck on the courtroom part of it. There was a corpus of Neo-Babylonian court records, like this one, okay, where I came across a footnote saying that no one has ever, there's long been a need for a study of courtroom procedure in this period. So I said, well, when you see a footnote saying there's been a need, you immediately say my dissertation will then meet that need. That's kind of, again, tip for, and so I worked on that with the end goal somewhere, thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll write about the biblical stuff also. I ended up not getting that far. I ended up finishing with a doctorate in a doctoral dissertation on Neo-Babylonian court procedure. And the main comparative work that I did there was outside of the Neo-Babylonian period. I kind of branched out into other periods and situated it in the earlier history of Mesopotamian cuneiform law. Once I was Dr. Holtz, I came to Yeshiva University, and the first set of articles that I wrote were actually on the Isaiah material, or some of the Isaiah material that I had hoped to write about earlier. Then I spent time concurrently with that. I had kind of read a lot on legal metaphors and courtroom metaphors in particular, and one of the important articles that are well known is an article by Baron Gemser called "The Riv, or Controversy Pattern in the Hebrew Mentality." I think it is. I don't remember the exact title. Once I had this background in ancient court procedure, I could go wherever I wanted with it. And so, as I said, I started with Isaiah. Then I went on and I wrote this article on prayer. And in the audience, when I first presented the work, or one of the times I presented the work, one of my teachers actually came up to me and said, "There's more there." And I kind of filed that, there's more there, kind of filed that in the back of my mind, and began writing chapters of the book, presenting them originally as oral papers and talks at conferences and other places. Eventually, it became the book sort of the book project. Other scholarly work that I had sort of engaged with along the way was an important work on the Book of Job by Rachel Magdalene, who did what I do for prayer for the Book of Job, where again, people had noticed that the Book of Job seems to be a lawsuit against God. There seems to be a lot, law figures prominently in the book. What she did was she worked with the Neo-Babylonian material to anchor Job's courtroom imagery. Earlier work on prayer, such as Greenberg's well-known small 3-chapter book on prayer and prose prayer, and the work of Yosef Heinemann actually on rabbinics, all had some mention of the courtroom thing is important. No one had done what I did, so I did it, and that was that.
All right. So this is a little on the more personal level. I was just wondering, in the course of writing this, do you find that your personal tefillot, your personal prayers, have become more meaningful, more informed?
hard to know when it's become that way, right? It's hard for me, it's hard to know. It is, it's an interesting question to ask of a work of scholarship, but it's hard to divorce oneself from one's scholarship. I'm not going to say that I can, I do talk about some of the prayers that I have recited regularly. I would say it's probably the other way around, is that I kind of was familiar with the notion from some places, and then I said, there's, I know more about this. That's probably the best I could willing to share here.
All right. Now, I am particularly fascinated with shorshim, with roots of Hebrew words, and I knew that there were various ways to describe prayer, but I didn't realize there were so many subcategories of tefillah. So could you just talk about some of the roots that are involved?
So one of the things I do in the book, or I kind of mention in the book, is that etymology alone is not going to help us here, right? So, it's very always in vogue or always popular to probe the roots of Hebrew words for some sort of significance. One of the things that I avoided or tried to bury in footnotes was the kind of etymological discussion, because one of the things that happens is when you start looking at these roots. So let's take the example of the most common word for prayer in the Hebrew Bible, which is tefillah, which is the word that it is. When you look at it and the verb associated with it, you notice that it is overwhelmingly about prayer. So there's not much you can learn from that other than that it means prayer. And then what you find is when you engage the literature on the etymological literature on this, you find all kinds of crazy suggestions, because everyone has to find the next cognate for this word. The Hebrew stuff, the Hebrew material, once you look beyond, it's something like 80% or 90% of the occurrences of the word or the root are associated with prayer. So they're not going to do very much than tell you that it means prayer. The one or two examples that you have, or the few examples that you have of that root, of those terms outside of prayer, are in the end obscure. Or not, don't tell me very much about how they would have been used outside of prayer. You get a sense that it has to do with law, and everyone figures that it must have something to do with law, but what exactly is a problem? And how you get from what it means in the law, in the human courtroom, to what it means in prayer is another problem. So you can follow up the literature on this, and you'll see all kinds of contortions that people go through. And the next thing to do is, after you've exhausted the Hebrew, they move on to the Akkadian and to the Arabic, and everything is a game of getting from some meaning in another language to, isn't it obvious that it means prayer then, right? Not always. Usage is much more helpful, actually. If you go looking at the words, you'll see that sometimes even when it means prayer, and sometimes when it doesn't, you actually see that it does retain some kind of connection to the court of law. You can read chapter 1 in the book to see what I mean by that. Other terminology that if you want to talk about methodology here, you talk about how, for me, it's a question of finding the human analog, what Moshe Greenberg refers to as the social analogy on which prayer is modeled. Right? If we assume that that prayer is talking to God, then there are patterns of speech, how you talk to someone, and you might be imitating different things, right? So if I say play ball, right, that's clear that I'm using it as I'm talking like an umpire, right? So Greenberg talks about royal models and other things like that. I suggest the courtroom, but the goal is always to find the human analog to this to prayer. So you go into another example is which I devote some attention to, is this notion of prayer as calling out. Right? Those Hebrew speakers here, karat likro el, whatever, or litzok el, to cry out to. In both those cases, there is a sort of an established understanding that you're modeling your speech on speech to the king, who was the ultimate legal authority. Right? You can call out to the king, and there are a number of narratives in the Bible and elsewhere that talk about calling out to the king as a way of redressing some problem that the regular legal system is not addressing, either because the king is at the top of that or because he's outside of it and therefore can solve it for you. And if that doesn't work, then you can call out to the ultimate authority, which is, whoever, authorities, depending on your, where you're writing. So there too, there's a sort of, I would say it's a sort of quasi-legal or semi-legal use of prayer terminology, because the examples that we find are cases, for example, you have a woman in the Hebrew Bible who calls out because her land has been reappropriated. She wants to reestablish ownership of a plot of land, and things like that. So there is a sort of a sense in my mind, anyway, that this is a legal concept there too. So those are two examples of terminology that I explore more fully in the book in terms of understanding the words for prayer. And the key here is that, unfortunately, until let's say after the Talmud, or maybe slightly before, no one really wrote about prayer in that way, right? No one sat down and said, I'm going to now talk about what we do when we pray. Like, what are we thinking about? So it takes the philosophical awareness happens later. So when you want to look at ancient sources and what did they say about this question, you really have to look at about the words they used, and sometimes they tell you a story, so it's useful also.
I just have two more questions, and then we're going to open this up to the audience, which I'm sure has questions. You mentioned in the book intertextual comparisons of how biblical characters approach human judges with a plea resembling prayer. Just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
One example that I use and kind of figures in the book a few times is a story that's told twice in the book of Jeremiah, the story of the last king of Judah who imprisons Jeremiah and then comes to him and asks him for a true prophecy, knowing that he puts him in prison because he's not happy with what he's saying, but he still wants to know what he has to say. So, and Jeremiah uses the opportunity to give him the prophecy and then try to get out of jail. And he uses a term that ultimately ends up, that also is shared, the term tichina, petition or plea. He addresses a plea to the king. I argue in much the same way that one might address a tichina to, what ends up being in the Yiddish tchina, to God. So that's an example. So that's Jeremiah 37. We'll get there.
Okay, and lastly, just tell us about, where you grew up, where you went to school, and is anybody else in your family that influenced your choice of career and all this kind of interesting stuff?
So I'll say that I'm the son of two academics.
What a shock.
There's not, surprises are not going to come from the biography. They both cultivated. One is a chemist. The other is a professor of Hebrew literature. Both cultivated my quirks, and I was lucky enough to be introduced to some of the people who I quote in the book before I even was old enough to read their work. So there was that. I mean, that was kind of the environment in which I was shaped intellectually. There was often a conversation about the relationship between this and the museums that we were going to, or biblical materials. I was a competitor in the National Bible Contest in the Chidon HaTanach back in the day. So that was already, whether that was a cause or an effect is an interesting question. I went to school. Where did I go to school? So formally, that's part of my life began in the Yeshiva of Central Queens, then at Ramaz. I studied a year at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and it used to be a thing, Ramaz, Gush, and then Harvard. That was sort of, there was almost a cliche, and I was one of them. At Harvard, I took Akkadian. I also had some interaction with biblical scholarship and Hebrew language. And then I think the most formative part of my education, kind of the part that really you can kind of see in the book, I guess, is my time at the University of Pennsylvania, which there's even a book about, before my time obviously, the Pennsylvania Tradition of Semitics. It's a book that was written by Cyrus Gordon in the 1980s or 90s. And there they talked about how and Greenberg himself was a professor there, studied there, then was a professor there before he moved to the Hebrew University. Barry Eichler, who was my advisor, Jeffrey Teague, who was on the committee, all of them were products of this similar mode of thought, which bled over to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is where Teague studied. The notion that Professor Eichler actually kind of used the phrase, a common cultural heritage, which is the title of the book in his honor we published a few years ago. That was published a few years ago, that there was this there are a lot of commonalities between biblical literature and ancient Near Eastern literature, to the extent that we only benefit by comparing the two. This, I think, is, I humbly say, is another product of that school of thought. And I guess the emphasis on law, that comes from Eichler. That comes from, again, that's Penn. Penn was a lot about that. That's because Eichler's professor was E.A. Spicer, who was interested in law as well. Long-standing discussion of preoccupation with cuneiform law. They're going back, I guess it's almost 100 years at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm opening the courtroom for anybody in the audience to ask questions.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Starts a bit more basic. How did you establish the direction of influence from the courtroom? I'm assuming intuitively, I think we would assume that it's more likely that influence had been from the courtroom to people's personal prayers, but were you able to establish that it only moved in one direction?
So it's interesting that you ask that, because, so just to repeat the question is, I claim that it's the courtroom to prayer. I don't make a big deal out of the direction, but I think, as you say, intuitively, it seems that human language would then be the model for language. Although one of my interlocutors, not in the book, but one of the people who I regularly talk to, I just read something by him where he suggests the opposite. Where he suggests that line that I said, the line in the legal text, it really occurs only late in the legal tradition, the idea of demanding judgment. And so he's apparently going to suggest in writing at some point that actually bleeds in the other direction, that people knew about prayers and then they write about the court, they incorporate it into the courtroom. I don't know how we're ever going to prove it one way or the other. The problem being that how do I know that when I see it in the courtroom document here, it wasn't orally and floating around, or even in writing, I just haven't found it yet. So I remain with the intuition, but I'm not going to get into a fight with the guy over this. He's too nice a guy.
More of an etymological question.
Yeah.
So did you do anything with the word that hispalel as meaning tefillah appears an oversized amount of times when someone's praying on behalf of somebody else? Spell ba'ad, alav. And did you make anything of the absence of the word in perhaps the greatest example of prayer for judgment, and that is in Avram's case for stone, where as far as I recall, the word doesn't appear, but...
Right. And it's often interpreted as a example of prophetic intercession, sort of the prime example. So it's not there. I can't say that it's always... it's not there in Moses' case either. Right? When Moses prays for the nation after the golden calf incident.
That one is, but other instances it
there
is.
might be, yes, okay.
But not lecture.
Yeah, but the two main examples, it doesn't occur. And so I'm not going to make much of the absence of it. In the example that you just talked about with Abraham, it's actually interesting because somebody actually here in the library, Reuven Kimmelman, who was once a visiting professor here a few years ago, actually asked me that very question. Why do people think this is legal, and why do they think it's prayer? So the prayer part I can't really answer, but the legal part I think I gave an answer in the book. I recommend you read it. There's the positioning, right, by Yigash and so on. And he also refers to God as Hashafei Kol Haaretz, as the judge of all the land. So those two are, kind of answers, yeah. So I don't know. It's a good question. We'd have to work on it a little bit more. But I think basic, off the cuff, shooting from the hip, I would say two things. One, I'm not alone in thinking of it as prayer. Two, I think it's, God, he is talking to God and, bargaining and asking for something, I guess. So why it's prayer exactly, I don't know. But it is taken as, it is quite often taken as such. The one thing that I would say is that regarding Abraham specifically, in Genesis 20, it does talk about that he is, the only time he's called a prophet, a Navi, it is also mentioned. There it does say, let him pray on their behalf.
But that's also for somebody else.
Correct.
That's
yes,
also...
it's true. Let him pray out. Right. Prophets are meant to intercede. That's their big job. I think we're getting a little hyper specialized. So probably have to go to a sidebar at some point. Take anything else? Questions or words? Technical or otherwise? Okay. Leave you speechless. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
There's a particular song
Yeah.
where Pinchas is mentioned as Vayifalel.
Right.
How do you see that?
So I take that as just in line with the others, and that's another example of some sort of intercession on behalf
Intercession
of.
or prayer?
Yeah, prayer. I'm not gonna, I don't need to correct the text and put in a tav and say vayit palel. It's not out of the question, but I think lefalel is also a word, which means to speak or something like that. So I'm not going to worry about it too much. I don't make much of it here. I cite it once as a footnote. There's not much else to say about it other than he stands,
right,
which is important for me. Vayamo. Okay, so that's what I can say. Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much.